Hi everyone. Today, I want to talk about Freudian dream interpretation, and most importantly, how Freudian dream interpretation help us to conceive the world and perceive beauty. Let us start with dreams. When we sleep, we dream. But when we wake up, often we can recall only a few elements that is left over from the dream. Freud calls the elements that we remember after waking up the manifest content. And this content is not the true reality of the dream itself, obviously. It is a superficial layer that veils the reality of the dream, which he calls the latent content. The latent content is desires that are the underpinnings of all our dreams and all the unconscious activity. Think about this as a palace, where the latent content is the desires working together, the forces working together to construct a palace of manifest content, a palace of dreams. And in the end, it is only the palace that we see, not the latent content. So we can only access the manifest content, the thing we remember, and not the latent content itself directly. Now then, let's focus on the process in which the two overlap. The process in which the latent content transforms itself into the manifest content. Freud calls this process the dream work, whereby the latent content, things we don't remember, transform themselves into the manifest content, the things that we do remember. Think of this in terms of cryptography. You have the plain text, you have the encryption process, and you have the ciphertext. The plain text is the latent content that you don't get to see. The process of encryption is the process of dream work, while the ciphertext, the thing that you get to see, is the manifest content. Now, an analyst's job is similar to a psychoanalyst's job, indeed, that if you want to break the code, you want to decrypt the ciphertext, you need to go to the reverse process. You only have access to the ciphertext, but you want to uncover the plain text. Now, this happens in dreams as well. We only have access to the manifest content, but we want to uncover the latent content behind them. But if you want to break a code, a beneficial thing to know is how the code is written in the first place. In other words, if you want to reverse the process, it would be beneficial if we can know how the plain text become the ciphertext in the first place. So in other words, what Freud is trying to figure out, if he wants to break the dream, then he needs to figure out how does the latent content become the manifest content in the first place. And indeed, that is what Freud does, investigating the relation between the manifest content of dreams and the latent content, latent thoughts, and of tracing the process by which the latter is transformed into the former. In other words, what Freud wants to do is that he wants to figure out how the dream work works. Now, in order to explain how the dream work works, he offers up three mechanisms. The first mechanism is the mechanism of condensation. Here we observe that we can recall only a few elements from our dreams of last night. But clearly, there's something wrong going on here, because we slept for 8 hours and a lot happened. Why is it that we only remember the few? Why is it that there's only so few amount of manifest content that we can recall? Freud argues that this is because condensation took place. It is because a major amount of latent content got condensed, distilled, and crystallized into the few manifest content that we are able to see. And indeed, he says that it is in fact never possible to be sure that a dream has been completely interpreted, even if the solution or the explanation seems satisfactory or without gaps. This possibility always remains that the dream may have another meaning. What he says is that when we condense so much into so few, and we try to reverse the process by thinking of what the so few represents, we might overlook certain things in this process. Now, the second mechanism of the dream work is the mechanism of displacement. What is important to note here is that in A, like in symbol, in the latent content, is not necessarily the A or a symbol in the manifest content. This is the same as any cryptography. The same letter does not appear for the same meaning in both the ciphertext and the plain text. And then Freud argues that a transference or displacement of psychical intensities occur as a result of the distance between how the text of the dream content and the dream thoughts that come about. In other words, it is the distance between the latent content and the manifest content creating a need for the latent content to displace itself into other things in the manifest content. And this is the gap that creates this need for displacement. So in terms of the dream, an A in the latent content in the dream, in the desires, might mean a letter B in the manifest content. Now, Freud explains that this might be due to censorship. That because certain desires that we have are intrusive and disturbing, that is, we cannot represent it directly in the manifest content, because if that happens, well, we're waking up, and then the dream is not properly registered. So in order to avoid the disturbing desires, certain distortions need to be made, certain displacement need to be made, and thus censorship creates this displacement. And the third mechanism that Freud argues is the mechanism of secondary revision and the representation of relations. In this mechanism, Freud gives a simple example. In our system of writing, abs means that two letters are to be pronounced in a single syllable. Well, if you split them, A and B, we know that A is the last letter of the last word, while B is the new letter, the first letter of the new word. To put it into concrete terms, think about these two words, abscissa and a ball. In the first word, because A and B are put together, they are pronounced in one syllable. But in the second word, because a ball, A and B are separated, they're spatially distinct from each other, they are pronounced not in the one syllable. What this means is that space, relation, and the presence of absences and of gaps matter in dreams. That it is not only that what are the symbols in dream that matters, but also how those symbols are connected and interacting with each other. And Freud concretizes this relationship into two ways, which we can neatly summarize with Ramon Jakobson, a linguist, work. The two cases of relation that Freud argues that happen in the dream are first, observe on the vertical axis of selection, of synchronic existence. This is where metaphors in dream happen, right? We see A is B, B is C. And this simultaneity in time is when the perception of ourselves, we perceive them in unity, in one single point in time. While on the horizontal axis, the relation of dream becomes a relation of combination, in which different symbols condensed from different latent contents are juxtaposed next to each other, A and B instead of A is B. And in this sense, the dream functions metonymically in a diachronic time that does not last only 1 second, but a chain of time. And those two relations conjures up how the materials and the symbols in the dream organize themselves. And in Jakobson's term, this is called a poetic function. However, in Freudian term, this is precisely called the dream work, in the process which symbols in the dreams are organized and rearranged into a form that is comprehensible in the end. Now, by this point, I believe that there are certain doubts in the audience that I must answer. Some of you who studied psychology before might be thinking, well, isn't Freud wrong? I mean, none of his theory were scientifically proven or experimentally justified. So according to science, he must be, wrong. So you might be thinking, well, why did I present you a failure of a theory? But perhaps that is not the way to think about it. Perhaps the way to think about it is by what standard is he a failure? And clearly the standard in question here is the standard of scientism, this belief that science solves everything. And according to the standard of science, Freud clearly isn't right. But I would like to question that. Why science? Why does it seem that our default position in response to Freudian theory is science? Why is it that we have to reject his theory just because science says so? Why is it there's a tendency among us to categorize everything based on the taxonomy of scientific discourse, and if it doesn't fit, we throw it away, rejecting it, dismissing it, and say it's wrong. Why is that the case? And I think perhaps that is not the best way to think about it. Perhaps we shouldn't treat science as the answer to everything we have, or at least not the only answer to everything we know. Indeed, by admitting that it is, you are overlooking so much more in the process. By treating that science is the panacea as the standard in which everything must be evaluated upon, you overlook beauty in those analogies, in those frameworks, and the theories that science rejected in the first place. By treating science as something that overpowers all, you're essentially trapping yourself in the evaluated systems of zeros and ones, of truth and falsities, overlooking beauty in a process. I mean, take a look at the example of displacement, which can reinterpret the Freudian displacement according to Derrida's theory of difference and trace. Derrida being one of the major 20th century theorists who work on deconstruction. And we think about displacement not as a one-off activity, but as a group, as a series of chains of signification, as one symbol does not point to one meaning, but one symbol points to another symbol, yet another symbol. And in this infinite chain of signifiers connecting signifiers, we don't actually see the signified, which is how, if you're a scientist, will critique Freudian theory. You will tell me that, well, you never get to the thing itself. You're trapped in this infinite chain of signification, in this infinite ring of signifiers, of symbols, of elements in the dream, but you never get to the thing itself. You never get to the signified. You never get to the latent content, which supposedly was all psychoanalysis was all about in the first place. And the science will reject this theory. But perhaps they overlook something in the process. It is perhaps only with gliding between those chain of significations that you encounter so much more that the science overlooked and missed early on. It is only by this exploration between different significations and different symbols that you uncover so much more meaning and significances than science would do in the first place. So in the end, people ask, is psychoanalysis right? Is Freud right? But perhaps that is not the most important question to be asked. What should be asked is what Freud had done for us. And I think primarily his contribution lies in two aspects. First, Freud's action of having the courage to go out and chart the territory of the so-called unmappable unconscious is an act of courage in itself, hence why we call him the founder of discursivity. And the second contribution and implication from his theory, which by far I think is much more important, is that he gave us freedom. He gave us an alternative. In response to the strict understanding of science, he gave us an alternative to understand and interpret the dreams ourselves, to think about it in ways that we have choice. We can choose how to interpret. And I think this is crucial in this world where science is prevalent and theory is receding, that this freedom must be asserted. And ultimately, maybe instead of blaming the dreams, blaming the desires, and rejecting and dismissing all the interpretative efforts that has been made to understand those things, maybe we should try to embrace them. Maybe we should try to interpret, to understand, to comprehend the dreams, the desires, the working of the unconscious in ourselves, because they are part of ourselves in the first place. And that is what I want to leave you with. What if we start understanding, interpreting, and embracing the desires and the dreams instead of rejecting them? What would happen then to our dreams and the world we dream of? Thank you.